Presiding Officer, in the last week, a United Nations expert on violence against women offered to provide expertise to the First Minister on the Gender Recognition Bill. Rima Salim raised concerns that the bill would potentially open up the door for violent males to abuse the process of acquiring a gender certificate. Her report states, and I quote, "This presents potential risks to the safety of women in all their diversity, including women born female, trans women and gender non-conforming women." Last night, the Scottish Conservatives asked Parliament to simply acknowledge the report of the UN Rapporteur, but the First Minister voted against it. First Minister, why can't you accept the concerns raised by the United Nations Special Rapporteur?
First Minister.
Firstly, Presiding Officer, can I also take the opportunity to pay tribute to the life and legacy of Doddie Weir. He was a hero on the rugby pitch, but he was perhaps even more so an inspiration off of the rugby pitch. There is, of course, a question later in this session of FMQs that will allow me to pay more fulsome tribute to Doddie, but for now, let me say that my thoughts and condolences are with his wife, children and all of his loved ones. On the specific issue, not only do we acknowledge the comments made, it's not a UN report, these were comments by a UN Special Rapporteur. Not only have we acknowledged that those comments have been made, the Cabinet Secretary has written a substantial response to them. I believe that response can be found on the Scottish Parliament website because it was sent to the Equalities Committee, which of course is the lead committee on this bill. Of course, a number of organisations representing women who suffer male violence and abuse, including Rape Crisis Scotland and Scottish Women's Aid, have been part of a number of organisations who have responded as well and have set out in a number of respects why they disagree with those comments. I take the safety of women and girls very seriously, perhaps more seriously than any other issue, as I'm sure all of us do. I've spent much of my adult life and indeed all of my years in public office seeking to do things along with others to help advance the rights of women and girls and to ensure better protection for women and girls against male violence. Of course, any man who wants to abuse a woman, certainly in my experience, and I think this will be shared by many across the chamber, do not need to in some way pretend to be a woman in order to do so. And any who did feel that need, of course, don't need a gender recognition certificate. Our focus as a parliament, our focus as a society should be on those who perpetrate violence against women and girls, and that is men. Not all men, of course, but it is men who abuse women, and that should be our focus. In taking on these issues and debating these issues fully and respectfully, which I believe is really important, what we should not do, in my view, is further stigmatise a group in society, a very small minority in society, who are already perhaps the most marginalised and stigmatised group in society. I'm, of course, talking about trans people. In any group of society, where there are bad faith actors, we deal with them. We don't stigmatise the entire group. And I believe that very strongly as well.
Douglas Ross.
I'm not then sure from the First Minister's answer why she couldn't have voted for the Conservative amendment yesterday, which simply asked Parliament to acknowledge that report from the Special Rapporteur, which the Cabinet Secretary has responded to, yet the First Minister and the majority of SNP MSPs couldn't support that. But let's just have a look at the valid concerns that have been raised by this expert. Reem Assalim says, and I quote, "The efforts to reform existing legislation by the Scottish Government do not sufficiently take into consideration the specific needs of women and girls, particularly those at risk of male violence and those who have experienced male violence. To prevent the risk of attacks on women, my Scottish Conservative colleague Russell Finlay submitted an amendment to ban convicted sex offenders from changing gender. But the Scottish Government voted that amendment down. So why does the First Minister believe that a convicted male sex offender should be able to change their gender when there is a risk that they will exploit the system to attack women?
First Minister.
Firstly, not only has the Cabinet Secretary responded in detail to the comments of the Special Rapporteur, and I would encourage all members and all members of the public with an interest here to read those comments, because it sets out very clearly why, respectfully, we do not believe that these concerns are well-founded, and that sets out the reasons for that very fully and very clearly. The Cabinet Secretary will also meet with the Special Rapporteur next week to discuss these concerns in more detail. And of course, this is a bill that has not only gone through 2 public consultations, is currently going through very extensive parliamentary scrutiny. And in terms of stage 2 of the bill, a number of amendments have been passed, and that has responded to a number of the concerns that have been raised with members across all sides of this chamber. There are some amendments that the Cabinet Secretary will have set out again very fully and very clearly to the committee why the government could not support those amendments and the reasons for that. And of course it's for the committee then to vote and to decide on these matters, and ultimately it will be for this Parliament as a whole to reach decisions at stage 3, which of course we will reach before the end of this parliamentary session. These are difficult issues that people have that have strong views on different aspects of this. I think it's really important that we engage seriously, that we engage respectfully, that we engage in detail, and that we remember all of us see protecting women and girls as a priority, but I hope all of us also see protecting the rights of trans people as important too. And actually, I feel that part of my duty is to set out clearly why I do not believe, having considered in great depth all of these issues over a long period of time, why I do not believe these objectives are conflicting. In fact, I believe that it is important we advance both of these things, and that is what the government is seeking to do.
Douglas Ross.
I agree with the First Minister that we have to treat this with the seriousness and respect it deserves and look into detail with these things. But again, I asked a very simple question as to why the government couldn't support Russell Finlay's amendment, and we got no answer on that. I think we should surely all be able to agree that convicted male sex offenders should never be able to change their gender. This is not about trans people. These people are criminals, and that is exactly what Russell Finlay was trying to stop. But the First Minister is also trying to say that the government has dealt with this issue, but the UN expert says differently. The Special Rapporteur said this: "The Scottish Government does not spell out how it will ensure a level of scrutiny for the applications made to acquire a gender recognition certificate. Other governments that have adopted a self-identification procedure for the legal recognition of a gender identity have done so." So other governments did the necessary work before changing the law, but the First Minister hasn't. And right now, there are live court cases that could have a material impact on this bill. The UN expert says the government should, as a minimum, await the outcome of the judgments on these very issues in front of both Scottish and UK courts. So the First Minister said this bill is currently going through extensive scrutiny. Therefore, surely, First Minister, you must agree to pause the bill until we've heard these legal judgments.
First Minister.
It's ultimately for Parliament to determine whether or not a bill passes through this chamber. On the issue of sex offenders, let me set out in more detail the reasoning for the government's position on that particular amendment. Current provisions for management of sex offenders are robust and effective. However, we will expand, and this has been made clear during stage 2, we will expand the reporting requirements to include notification about an application for gender recognition. It's important to point out that under the existing process in the 2004 Gender Recognition Act, there is no requirement that an applicant must be what that amendment would have required. And the amendments lodged by Russell Finlay, our consideration is that they would not be compatible with the European Convention on Human Rights. So while we think that the processes for sex offender notification requirements are already working well, notwithstanding that, the Scottish Government has made clear that before the Gender Recognition Reform Bill is commenced, we will introduce legislation to amend the sex offender notification requirements to include notification about an application for a gender recognition certificate. So we are taking these issues seriously, but we are seeking to proceed in a way that will ensure the bill is compliant with the European Convention on Human Rights. And we have been open to other amendments put forward, including by Jamie Green, a member of the Conservative group. On the comments of the Special Rapporteur, we take these seriously. That is why we have responded in detail. But respectfully, we do not believe that those criticisms are well-founded. And that's not a view that we hold alone. Organisations that work day in and day out with women and girls
Briefly,
who are
First Minister.
subject to male violence, Rape Crisis Scotland, Scottish Women's Aid, also believe that many of these criticisms and concerns are not well-founded. So we will continue to proceed carefully. There has been considerable consultation and considerable scrutiny of this bill, and that is right and proper.
Douglas Ross.
On the First Minister's response on sex offenders, we know as a result of a Scottish Conservative Freedom of Information request that in the last 3 years in Scotland, more than 500 times a sex offender has changed their name. So if they can change their name so easily and for the reasons they want to, why would they not also change their gender if this now becomes easier as a result of this legislation? I also asked, and I know and I understand this was a complex issue, and the First Minister didn't mention the point about the live legal cases that are currently ongoing, for which the Special Rapporteur asked for this legislation to be delayed. Those judgments are crucial, and a delay would be sensible. It is far better that this Government and this Parliament makes good laws rather than quick laws. We want to make legislation with full and proper consideration of all of the implications. But for some reason, the Government seems determined to rush ahead at full speed to put this bill through this month that experts and women's groups say could have potentially damaging consequences. Now, the First Minister said the Special Rapporteur's criticisms are not well formed. Rima Salim is a United Nations expert. She is a Special Rapporteur on violence against women and girls. I personally think very few people can speak with greater authority on women's safety. The Scottish Parliament, including the committee in charge of scrutinising this bill, has not had the chance to examine her evidence and hear from her in person, which the Cabinet Secretary will be doing. So will the First Minister agree today to pause this legislation so we can properly consider the findings of a leading global expert on this crucial matter?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, I cannot comment on live legal cases and would be open to criticism if I did. Secondly, regardless of any individual's view on this legislation, one thing that cannot be said with any credibility or basis in fact is that it is being rushed through this Parliament. This process, through consultation, introduction of draft legislation, introduction of legislation, the formal parliamentary scrutiny process has been underway now, I think, for a period of 6 years. This has not been rushed. This has been done carefully and rightly so. Let me respond, before I come on to, again, the issue of the UN Special Rapporteur, to the issue about registered sex offenders. It is the case already that registered sex offenders must by law notify the police of any change of name. That requirement applies to an individual irrespective of what name they use or what gender they identify with, and that is important. Disclosure Scotland takes steps already to ensure that a person requesting a disclosure certificate does not succeed in avoiding the disclosure of any previous convictions by using a different name. So it's important to recognise the protections that are already in place, that this bill does nothing to change. And many of the issues that are being talked about here, and many of the issues that are sparking concern, I accept, are not issues that are changed or impacted in any way by the detail of this specific legislation. Now, coming back to the Special Rapporteur, it is because we respect that person and the role they hold that we are treating these concerns so seriously. The response, and again I would encourage every member to read the Cabinet Secretary's response on the Parliament's website. Cabinet Secretary will meet the UN Special Rapporteur next week. But there are other voices in this debate that also speak from a lot of experience and expertise, and it's not right to dismiss them either, because they are people who work with women that are subject to male violence every single day of the week. Lastly, Presiding Officer, given that we are speaking about a UN Special Rapporteur, the reforms in this bill align with the stated position of the UN Human Rights Office that trans people should be recognised legally, and I'm quoting, through a simple administrative process that does not require medical diagnosis. And lastly, Presiding Officer, Scotland is not the first country in the world to make changes of this nature. Many other countries have done so, and as the Cabinet Secretary's response to the UN Special Rapporteur sets out, the concerns that are being raised in the context of our legislation have not materialised in the experience of other countries who are ahead of us. So let's continue to treat these issues seriously, respectfully and calmly, and allow Parliament to continue to do its job properly.